Hello and welcome to the vlog. I sometimes have people say that I only ever show the idyllic side of narrowboating in my videos, so today something at the opposite end of the spectrum. To cut it short, I have broken down. I've been cruising along the Trent and Mersey, heading towards a winter mooring, and it's a beautiful day. Got up bright and early, managed to go about 50 yards before there was a sudden noise from the engine. A bit of a clonk, a bit of a sound like something had dropped off it, and then this whirring, metallic whirring, it's very hard to describe, but a noise that isn't normally there, and I can only say it was like a metallic whirring. And I thought, well, that isn't good, and it happens whether I'm in gear or out of gear, so it's on the engine itself, not the gearbox. As luck would have it, I happened to be immediately opposite Aston Marina, so I've gently, gingerly edged the boat into the marina, and they've said that's fine. I can call Canal Rescue, who are the Canal emergency service. They're going to be here in about an hour and have a look. In the meantime, I also had a look down to see if it was something obvious, of course, and I thought, well, maybe I'd better check the gearbox oil level, for example. Maybe it's something in the gearbox. And as I went to open the screw thing to look into the gearbox oil, I noticed the entire gearbox can actually rotate by about ½ an inch on the back of the engine. Fairly sure that shouldn't happen. Just have to sit and have a cup of tea, wait for the engineer to turn up and see what he says. That silver and green thing in the middle is the gearbox, and it bolts on from inside a housing on the back of the engine. Step 1 then was to clear the engine room of all the deck boards and junk that I keep in there, so the engineer would have access to take the gearbox and the housing off. Here he is removing the last bit of the deck board with a large screwdriver. Banging things is how much Canal engineering is done. Now he could go about taking off all the pipes, components and bits and bobs that get in the way of removing the gearbox. And there are lots of them, and they're all difficult to get to, of course. That, for example, is the fuel filter and coolant expansion tank. And that silver thing at the bottom is the prop shaft, which has been pushed outwards so there's space to get the gearbox off. The engine also needed to be lifted up, not totally out, but up by a foot or so, and this meant hanging a pulley from a block of wood across the hatchway. After much tinkering, the bell housing was off, and look, it should have 6 bolts holding the gearbox on, but 3 had fallen out, and 3 were very loose. Those lost bolts will have been rubbing the drive plate on the engine, which explains the metallic scraping noises. What's more, look at that oil dripping from the bottom. That's leaking around the crank seal, and explains at least one of the major leaks that have been driving me up the wall. I told the engineer we should definitely sort that at the same time. Speaking of the drive plate, there it is. It transfers motion from the engine to the gearbox, and those orangey pinky rubber mounts are supposed to smooth things out when you engage drive from neutral. Trouble is, they were knackered as well, so the drive plate had to come off, but we needed to do that anyway to stop the oil leak. This meant more ferreting around in the oily recesses of the engine bay, taking off the bolts that hold the plate against the flywheel. You see how springy the plate is when you turn it? You shouldn't really be able to do that by hand. They should be a lot stiffer to absorb the drive from the engine. I'll show you a comparison with a new one in a minute. And these are 2 of the bolts that had fallen out and been whacked by that drive plate as it went around. With everything now dismantled, I could do nothing but twiddle my thumbs until the replacement parts arrived, a new crank oil seal, new bolts and a new drive plate. But there was a problem. If I was just going to be hanging around on the pontoon, I would need power to top up my batteries. Now this was the end of October, beginning of November. There was no sunshine around. The solar was bringing in nothing. But with the engine in pieces, I could not run the engine to charge my battery. And on a visitor pontoon, it is just a pontoon at that particular marina. There was no shoreline I could plug into. So I needed to move the boat onto one of the full-time moorer pontoons where I could plug into power. But moving the boat also requires an engine that is not in pieces, which I did not have. What I needed was a tow. After a desperate plea to the marina management, they very quickly found a lovely couple of boaters who were willing to come alongside, tie the two boats together and tow me over to the moorers' pontoons, which have all the usual hookups that I'd need since I couldn't now run the engine to generate power. The proceedings were overseen by this happy chappy. Inevitably, as soon as we started moving, the wind started blowing, which makes slow, precise manoeuvring of a slab-sided narrowboat a bit tricky, not to mention two tied together. But our man here was absolutely superb, had everything poised and under control, gently, 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 and onto the pontoon. Within a few minutes, my boat was docked again. For the next few days, while I waited for the parts, my bedroom was like a scrapyard, with a ladder, some deck boards, the anchor, and other stuff from the engine room sitting there, as it made no sense to put it all back together. I'd packed as much as I could in the bilge, but it was strewn everywhere. The engine looked like I'd visited a dodgy part of town, resting on wooden blocks with the back taken off. The bell housing, which was fine, sat in a corner. Notice the gearbox itself was still in one piece. We didn't have to take that apart. It was just the bolts to the engine that had failed. And there's the old drive plate. Thankfully, a bright day had dawned when the next engineer visited to put everything back together. Here he is, Tom, a different bloke to last time, but again, a very decent chap who was happy to talk through and show me what he was doing. First of all, the flywheel came off, so he could replace that leaky oil seal. The flywheel was in decent nick. In there is the leaky seal, which had to be pried out. And no wonder it was leaking. The wretched thing had a dent in it, and several chips taken out of the metal too, probably from when it was first installed. Remember the old drive plate you could turn with your hand, and you shouldn't be able to? Compare that with a new one. Just enough give to take up the thump from the engine when you engage drive. Since we had the gearbox out, I got Tom to empty the old oil from it too. I normally can't get to the drain plug on the bottom and have to pump it from the top instead, which doesn't empty it as well. Now it was just a case of bolting everything back together with the new bits on. And after a couple of hours, ta-da! It was all running smoothly again and no nasty noises. Such a relief. I didn't realise until then how much I'd been stressed about it. It's now a week since the gearbox was put back on and everything put back together, but it hasn't been worthwhile actually going anywhere, in part because the weather hasn't been terribly nice, but also because the route I want to take down the Trent and Mersey has had a 3-week winter canal closure. In theory, that closure comes to an end this evening, so I'm now going to fire up the boat, head down that way and stop there this evening where the closure is, and then tomorrow when it's all cleared should be able to carry on. Crossed fingers that it will all be smooth sailing. With some trepidation I moved the boat off the pontoon and waved goodbye to Maggie, Ryan and Pixel, who'd been fantastic neighbours. There's a link to their YouTube channel in the video description. Then the engine went into forward and I chuntered slowly out of the marina and back onto the Trent and Mersey Canal. It felt great to be on the move again. And so, 4 weeks later than planned, I could finally move on to my winter mooring. Cheerio.